Hello, it's Anthony Chadwick from the Webinar Vet, welcoming you to another episode of VETchat. And I'm really thrilled today to have Professor Dave Goulson on the line. Dave has been doing fantastic work as Professor of Biology at University of Sussex on all things insects. I thoroughly enjoyed over the summer reading his book, Silent Earth, which he very kindly signed for me. And as a result of that, I've managed to get a piece of land to actually put a community orchard onto, David. So not only are your books interesting to read, but actually they force people to take action. So thank you so much for being the catalyst.
That's the idea. It's fantastic to hear that I've made a difference, even if it's a small bit of land or whatever it might be. Every little bit helps.
Well, I know the stat that often gets thrown around is since the war or just pre-war, we've lost 97% of our wildflower meadows, which I think was several million acres. So half an acre probably isn't going to make a huge difference. But as you say, every little helps, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. We had 7 million acres in 1930, and absolutely, 97% is the figure that seems to be bandied around. So yeah, it was damn near all of our wildflower meadows went. But we can recreate them, it can be done, and on big scales, small scales. We recently did some research with citizen science work with gardeners, asking them to create 2 by 2 meter square wildflower patches in their gardens. Um, and then we quantified how many insects there were in their gardens over the next 2 years. And there was a big increase in numbers of hoverflies, butterflies, bumblebees, and so on in the gardens with these patches. So it doesn't need to be a huge area to do some good.
And I think it's significant, often having read some articles, that biodiversity is often stronger in urban areas than in rural areas because, of course, if people are avoiding using some of the pesticides and herbicides, the garden network actually makes up a huge area of hectares, doesn't it?
At 400,000 is the rough estimate. So there's about 22 million gardens in the UK. Um, and yeah, for some creatures, I mean, my speciality are actually is bumblebees, and we found a long 20 years ago now that if you put a bumblebee nest in a garden, it grows much faster than if you put a bumblebee nest in a under a hedge in a farmer's field, because basically farmland isn't very friendly. There are hardly any flowers. There are lots of pesticides used. Whereas in urban areas, even if some gardens, may be pretty hopeless, plastic lawns or whatever, the bees can explore hundreds of gardens from their nest, and they're
Hmm.
bound to find a patch of flowers somewhere. And many gardeners don't use much in the way of chemical inputs or none at all. So yeah, the evidence is pretty clear that for at least some of the more adaptable of our
Hmm.
wildlife, urban areas are pretty good places. But of course, they could be better. If we could get
Yes.
everybody filling their gardens with wildflowers and not spraying pesticides, that would really help.
I think we have quite a lot of people listen to this from the veterinary community and obviously further afield. And I'd love people perhaps to go onto our Facebook page or LinkedIn and explain to me what is the attraction of plastic grass. I would like to understand what that is, Dave. I don't know if you're. I presume you're not a big fan of plastic grass, as you've just said.
You would presume correctly, yes. I cannot stand the stuff. You, I even saw and took a photograph and posted it on Twitter of a plastic hedge. Believe it or not, you can buy plastic hedges to complement your plastic lawn. I mean, it's awful. The plastic. It's essentially manufactured. Uses loads of fossil fuels. It's
Yes,
all going to end up in a landfill site within 5 or 10 years because you can't recycle that
because it
stuff.
looks scruffy.
Because it gets dirty, it fills up with cat poo and God knows
Yes.
what else.
And of course, it melted in the heat wave, which maybe serves them right. I don't know. We might get some plastic grass lovers now hitting on the site, but I can cope with that.
Yeah, horrifically, read a survey recently which suggested that 8% of gardens have at least some plastic grass in them these days. But I was pleased to see that 12% of gardens have a wildflower meadow, so we're slightly edging it.
Yeah, we need to do more. I do love my wildflower meadow at home. It's a very small patch of garden, but the number of insects you see in it are amazing. And of course, we can encourage. I did look. I'm not stalking you, Dave, honestly, but I did look at your very intricate and fancy earwig nest that you stick up in trees as well. You got very excited about that. I mean, you're not just Mr. Bumblebee; you are Mr. Earwig as well. I think.
If anyone wants to know how to make an earwig hotel or a bee hotel or any number of other silly things for wildlife, then my YouTube channel has practical tips as to how to do it. But yeah, earwigs are great. I'm a big fan of earwigs,
And they did
and
very well in that nest in that video that I did see. I can't remember the channel. Is it just Dave Goulson or what's the channel that
yeah,
people
it's
want to
if you
look
just
for YouTube?
I don't know, go into YouTube and type my name, you'll
Yeah,
find it
and
very easily.
earwigs and something will pop up. Um, Obviously, we've lost all these wildflower meadows, and I think it's great. I was at a practice Old Hall Vets who won our Green Vets of the Year a month or so ago up in the Lake District and saw, some of the cool things they're doing with a patch of land. I know Katrina McIntyre's up in Scotland, and she's sort of just let a field go back to, without any wildflower sowing, and she's got orchids on the orchids, not orchards, orchids on the grass that are coming back. So there's a lot of things that are dormant in there that if we actually give them a chance, if we don't cut our lawns, amazing things start to happen, don't they? And we cut out obviously use of fertilizer and the like.
Yeah, I mean, many of us have got basically a wildflower meadow already in our garden. We're just mowing it, so nothing ever gets to flower. But I just over to my left, I can see my lawn, and I don't cut it very often at all, only about 3 times a year. And it's full of, there's red clover, white clover, speedwell, buttercups, dandelions, daisies, selfie, all sorts of lovely flowers. Nothing very I haven't got any orchids. I'm really envious. A friend of mine has a small front garden and they live in the middle of Tunbridge Wells, and they stopped mowing it because 'cause I'd been badgering them to stop mowing it. And in 1 year, they had a whole bunch of orchids came up. No idea whether they were always there or
Yes.
whether they've seeded themselves or whatever, but I'm really envious of those. But yeah, it's surprising what turns up, and so, if I often say, if rather than getting if the mower out of the shed, get a deck chair and make yourself a
Hmm.
G&T and sit down and enjoy the flowers and the bees.
Well, and it's great to hear the noise. We get a lot on we have blackberry brambles within the hedge, and I'm not terribly tidy, so I let them grow until the neighbours really complain. Then I maybe chop back a tiny bit, and that hum of the honeybee is delightful to hear, isn't it?
Well, I probably a lot of that hum is also bumbles and
And
hoverflies as
bumbles as
well.
well, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but yes, the sound of insect life, all those busy insects buzzing about it should be part of spring and summer in this country, and it
yeah.
makes me really sad when I can't hear it.
Well, it's the
Um,
silent earth, as you said, isn't it?
Well, yeah, the title of my book,
Yeah, yeah.
depressingly.
And obviously, we're recording this at the moment with COP27. We're so pleased that Mr. Sunak decided he did have time to go. That was a good thing. I don't know whether it was because Mr. Johnson was going or whether enough of us complained that made him go, or maybe he just got down and did a hard weekends of work and then he felt he could go. But whatever it was, it's great he's there. Obviously, COP does do sustainability conferences, but we do seem a bit obsessed with carbon. Do you think that some of the policies that have come out, the stewardship schemes, Elm Scheme, should we be hopeful of government involvement, or has it just been a disappointment for too long that perhaps we need to just crack on as individuals and businesses and charities and
Uh,
associations?
yeah. Oh, crikey! There's about 5 questions snuck in there.
Sorry about
So
that.
no, that's fine. So I do think biodiversity. is a bit overlooked. That we have these sort of twin crises: climate change and biodiversity loss, and they're obviously interwoven. That many of the causes of one are the causes of the other, and many of the solutions are common to both as well, I think. But it seems like climate gets the bulk of politicians' attention at the moment. Um, but as for what we should do, I mean, clearly governments are not acting fast enough on either issue. Um, we've failed. Almost every country in the world's failed to meet all of its targets that were agreed in Paris. And realistically, we're going to go to at least 2 degrees warming, aren't we? I think you'd be hugely optimistic to think we can rein it in before that, and probably much higher, I suspect. Anyway, so if we wait for governments to act on climate, we're not going to get very far. And as for biodiversity, I was optimistic about what government was doing in the UK for a while. Michael Gove introduced this new ELMS Farm Subsidy Environmental Land Management Scheme, it stands for, which was going to be a whole new subsidy system for farming, which was going to really basically mean that farmers only got subsidies for looking after the environment, rather than at the moment, most of the subsidy is given out as a kind of area based payment. Um, and that was great, or at least it looked like it could be great. And I mean, I'm not Michael Gove's biggest fan, but I credit to him, when he was Environment Secretary, he was really on it. But unfortunately, this Elm scheme, after 4 years of development, has just been shelved. We don't know whether it's going to be revived or thrown in the bin, or what's going to happen. Farmers are left completely in the lurch, not knowing what's going to happen next. It's a shambles. So it would be great if Rishi gets around to it and revives it. I'm not convinced he will. He hasn't got the strongest environmental credentials. Time will tell.
Maybe the only hope we have is that he's appointed, hopefully, a really, really strong environmental minister, Dave.
You are joking.
Yes, well, I'm hoping, but having seen
Oh
some of the
dear.
tweets about glyphosate,
Glyphosate.
then
Yeah.
I'm not so sure she gets it all. Hopefully, she can be on a steep learning curve. We're talking about Therese Coffey at the
It
moment.
would be nice if she was, but I don't have any optimism at all, I'm afraid. Yeah, I mean, you allude to her 2018 tweet, which was a picture of a big bottle of Roundup glyphosate herbicide. Looked like it was on her garden picnic table, with her line underneath was something like, "I can't wait to get spraying my Roundup in the garden." And why would a government minister post that? I just can think of no earthly reason, and unless, you know, um, she was sponsored by Bayer or whoever. It is Bayer, in fact, that produced glyphosate. I'm not
Hmm.
suggesting she was. I'm sure she wasn't, but who knows what goes on behind the scenes. I just can't understand why any politician would be promoting garden use of herbicides.
Products, yeah. Yes, it's concerning, and obviously, we are at the moment in a situation where we're also trying to see, as vets, that we do no harm. You know, that we are there as forces of good for the environment and for the animals. Um, in fact, at the moment, we're getting involved in a One Health scheme to try and encourage people to take their antibiotics back to the pharmacies or the vets, be they human antibiotics or animal antibiotics, because believe it or not, a lot of people just flush antibiotics down the toilet, which again adds to the problem. And I think we're in danger, aren't we, of all the chemicals that we are using that are becoming more and more powerful, more and more potent, that we're creating problems actually within the environment where there's antibiotic resistant bugs in sewage farms, etc., etc. It's a worrying time, and I think similar things are happening, with parasiticides. Some of the powerful parasiticides that we've developed for agriculture now are banned, like DDT, but actually more powerful anti-parasiticides came after those, and we kind of closed our eyes a bit, didn't we? Because we thought we'd got rid of DDT, we'd solve the problem. Why do you think that happened?
It's a good question. I mean, there's a kind of long backstory which I'll have to cut very short. But 1962, Rachel Carson published *Silent Spring*, which was a kind of groundbreaking book which highlighted the fact that a lot of the pesticides that were in use at the time, which were pretty new creations, most of them are only really started to be used in the 1940s onwards. Things like DDT were poisoning farmers, livestock, wildlife, and so on. And there was a big controversy at the time. She was vilified by the pesticide industry, but ultimately it turned out, what she was saying was basically true. And the chemicals were mostly banned. DDT was banned, and so on. And I think environmentalists, conservationists thought at that point that the problem had been fixed. Um, but the sad reality is, when Rachel Carson wrote Silent Earth, there were 37 different pesticides available to farmers in the United States where she was based. Today, there are over 1,000 pesticides available to farmers in the United States, about 500 to European farmers.
Hmm.
And we keep finding that these pesticides that have got through the kind of regulatory process that have been in use for 10, 20, 30 years, ultimately many of them turn out to be much more harmful to the environment than we'd thought. And I think this really came to light, particularly with the neonicotinoids, which are a new group of insecticide, newish group of insecticides that were introduced in the 90s. Um, they are neurotoxins. They are about 7,000 times more poisonous to insect life than DDT was. Um, and they're used all over the world. And anyway, so eventually it came to light that they were killing bees and probably contributing to insect declines globally. And so again, neonicotinoids have been banned in Europe, at least not elsewhere yet, for farming use. But then it turns out something most people were unaware of, that you can still get hold of neonicotinoids to drip on your dog or your cat. These Advocate or Advantage is the active ingredient is imidacloprid, which is was the original neonicotinoid. Um, so it's kind of seems a bit of an anachronism that these things have been they're too dangerous for farmers to use, but ordinary untrained folk can drip them on their family
Hmm.
pet. And the various environmental issues relating to this, probably the most serious is that these kept flea treatments, both the active ingredient in Advocate and Frontline, which is something called fipronil is the active, um, are turning up in our rivers very frequently. In fact, we recently found fipronil in 100% of English rivers and imidacloprid in 70% of English rivers. Now, fipronil isn't used in farming, it never has been used in farming in the UK. So it's very hard to think where it could be coming from other than from our pets. So I have a PhD student, Rose Perkins, who's investigating this at the moment, and she's treating dogs with spot-ons and then trying to work out where they go in the environment. Do they go onto the dog's bed? Do they go onto the pet's hands? If the dog swims or is bathed, does it go down the drain or into a river and so on? We're trying to get a kind of accurate picture of the environmental fate. But it seems pretty certain that quite a lot of it is ending up in our waterways, often at levels that exceed what are deemed to be the safe limits for wildlife in those rivers. And that is something every dog and cat owner and every vet should be aware of, I think.
Do you know about the Webinar Vets courses? Our specifically crafted collections of webinars are the perfect way to learn about the veterinary topic of your choice. Take a deep dive into wound care or get your hands on a selection of our best parrot webinars. We'll have the perfect topic waiting for you. To find your next CPD course, visit thewebinarvet.com/courses.
I think these new products are much more specific. DDT obviously was causing harm. Peregrines were producing very thin eggshells, weren't they? And they weren't able to breed and so on. Whereas we've probably got better at producing more specific treatments that are, specific to insects. And as far as I'm aware, I don't think imidacloprid causes health problems to us. Obviously, I know there are problems with glyphosate and so on, but the problem is that they're also very potent, aren't they?
Yeah, so I mean, you're correct in that neonicotinoids are much less toxic to vertebrates than they are to invertebrates. Um, that's not to say that they're not toxic to vertebrates, but they are incredibly toxic. I mean, the dose that you're supposed to put on the dose of advantage that you're supposed to put on the neck of a medium-sized dog is enough to deliver a lethal dose to 60 million honeybees. So they're really they're kind of like Novichok for insects, if you like.
Hmm.
It's quite hard to get your head around how little it takes to do environmental damage. So although the amounts being found in rivers are obviously quite low concentrations, parts per billion typically, um, yet there's clear scientific evidence that things like mayfly larvae living in streams
Yes.
are sensitive to those kind of levels. That that's enough to do them harm.
What do you think the solution is to this problem? Obviously, they're a topical product. Is a an oral product a better product to use?
I, my suggestion to start with, I'm not a vet, but it would seem to me that prophylactic use is unnecessary, and that we could reduce any treatment quite considerably if animals were only treated as necessary rather than this once a month blanket treatment, which many vets are still encouraging as part of a pet care plan. Um, but if you do have to treat, then it's unclear, to be honest, because there hasn't been a kind of rigorous environmental risk assessment done on the alternatives either. But I think that the tablet treatments, the oral treatments, are probably, and say that rather cautiously, probably better than these spot-ons.
We did do. We had somebody speaking on dung beetles, and obviously the feces can obviously have metabolites. Again, we don't know exactly what, but certainly we know that um, cattle treated with various chemicals can end up with very few dung beetles in the pasture. Obviously, it's very easy to pick up a piece of dog poo. Not everybody does it. If you go for a walk anywhere, you'll notice that. But I think actually bagging it and putting it into a bin or landfill is much more a better way of dealing with it, because of course plastic bags are pretty impervious and take a pretty long time to break down, don't they?
Yeah, I would. I mean, if it's bagged and ends up in landfill, then probably from an environmental perspective, that's okay, sort of. I mean, so
It's not great for the
landfill is a
plastic,
whole
but we'll
different
live with
issue,
that.
but yeah, probably better than it ending up in our rivers, which these
Hmm.
external treatments seem
I
to.
know. Are we? I did large animal vetting for a few years when I qualified, and we had to be really careful with the drugs that we used on animals, because if we wanted to get the milk from them, or if at some point they were likely to be killed for meat, we had to make sure that there was a big enough withdrawal period that those chemicals weren't going into the milk or going into the meat. Do you think, to be more strict on the companion animal side in perhaps some of the testing that we do before we let products come through?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, as I understand it, many years ago, the decision was taken that veterinary products intended for companion animals didn't need the environmental risk assessments that are routinely done for drugs intended for livestock,
Hmm.
simply because the amount used was assumed to be so much smaller that it wasn't going to be a problem. We didn't need to worry about it.
Hmm.
Clearly, this whole tale of flea treatments ending up in rivers shows that decision was wrong, and I think it needs to be reevaluated. And clearly, I believe there's something like 8 million dogs and slightly smaller number of cats in the UK. Um, and quite a proportion of those are clearly treated with one or another of these drugs. That's clearly enough. I think that it warrants a proper environmental risk assessment of these products.
Finally, I just wanted to finish off with one of my favourite places, which I know is very close to you, which is Knepp. I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book Wilding. If you haven't read it, Isabella Tree, do read it. They took what was basically a degraded farm with degraded soil and just let it go back to nature, didn't they? With remarkable results. Do you think there's a lesson for us to learn? There is a bit of friction, obviously, between farmers and ecologists. Can Knepp help to bring those two groups together to produce something? I know there's a lot of farms that are part of Nature Friendly Network and so on, but do you think there's more that we can do? And is those sort of conversations with places like Knepp, are they a useful place for us to come closer together?
I love Knepp, absolutely. I go there quite a lot, and it's amazing actually to see how wildlife thrives if humans stop messing things up. Um, Rewilding isn't everybody's cup of tea, and many farmers really hate the term. I think they see it as a bit of a threat to their way of life. Um, but from my perspective, it seems reasonable to that on land that isn't very productive, that's not contributing much food. Um, and where it's only economic to farm with heavy subsidies from the taxpayer, um, that actually instead turning that land over to nature, carbon capture, and recreation. Thousands of people go and explore Knepp. It's a really amazing place to wander about. That seems to me something that it's a reasonable proposition. And if farmers, landowners want to do it, in those circumstances, I don't see why we shouldn't encourage them to do so. Nobody's suggesting we should be forcing anyone to do this.
Hmm.
Uh,
And it's
uh,
not for all land. This was obviously a piece of land that they really struggled to grow anything on. They had to use a lot of pesticides, and they were at the point where it wasn't making any money. And I think sometimes there's a danger if we're putting our subsidies in the wrong places, which encourages bad behaviour instead of good places like Elms. This is where government can be a force for good or a force for harm. They need to decide which way they want to go, don't they?
yes, indeed. Um, I mean, so the original version of Elms had a portion of it specifically devoted to funding rewilding projects. They said I think they wanted something like 30,000 hectares of minimum of rewilded land in the UK, and they were setting more ambitious targets into the future. So it would be fantastic from my perspective if that was revived. Of course, we need to grow food. We need to support more conventional
Hmm.
farming as well. Um, I personally would like to see the full version of this Elms thing rolled out, so that there's really strong financial incentives for all farmers to do more to look after the
Hmm.
environment. And we do need to build bridges. It's unfortunately the case that often farmers get criticised by conservationists, and equally farmers are pretty critical of conservationists and see them as the enemy. Um, and we need to overcome that because we've all, at the end of the day, got the same
Hmm.
interests at heart. We all want to eat, and we all want a healthy environment with lots of wildlife and healthy soils. So somehow we need to come together. And there are some really exciting initiatives. There's some great farmers. You mentioned the Nature Friendly Farming Network, which has got hundreds of people involved from all around the country, trying to explore ways to farm in a more sustainable and environmentally friendly way and produce food and make a profit at the same time. And we can do it, but we do need to kind of pull together and ideally get the government to help. But if they're not going to help, then we'll have to do it without them, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of things to be hopeful for, a lot of new initiatives like agroforestry, which obviously probably happened previously. We just called it rotational agriculture and things. But thank you so much. Obviously, I'd like to think of myself as a person of hope. I know Greta Thunberg wants us to panic a bit, and probably we should. But at the same time, we can only do our own actions in our own area. And I think we had a talk from a psychiatrist who talked about solastalgia, which is this existential dread, for the planet. And actually, in the end, if we are depressed and everything, then we're not going to be able to do our best work. So it's important that we all do our little bits, and those little bits of lots of individuals can add up, can't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Do worry about the state of the environment, but I don't lose sleep at night because I figure I'm doing what I can, and if we all are doing what we can, then that has to be good enough. Um, and as another thing Greta has pointed out many times is that it's not a kind of pass fail. Everything we do will make the future slightly better. Will reduce the severity of climate change. Will reduce the number of species that are lost. So, it's all worth doing. I mean, there's no doubt that climate change is going to get worse and that we will continue to lose species from this planet. But we can mitigate both of those things if we try. And obviously we have to get cracking. Time is very much of the essence.
Yeah. Dave, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast. I've really appreciated it. I always learn when I listen to you and read your books. So thanks again.
Absolute
This was
pleasure.
Anthony Chadwick from the Webinar Vet, and this was VETchat. Thank you.